We are very honored to have Dr. Simone Chun, who is Assistant Professor at the Department of Architecture, National University, Singapore. And also we have two students to give a presentation too. It was very nice because when we started to organize this conference, I thought we should include some interesting people who are looking at research-based architecture or research-based design. And then, because we had sort of a long-term collaboration with Shimon in the US, and she must be the most appropriate person we should invite. And because she's now having a lot of interesting projects, and also recently she just well, actually she's now a curator of the Singapore Pavilion in the 70th Venice Biennale International Architecture Exhibition, which is now going on, and so she's just back from Venice now. And I think that kind of, curatorship and also the kind of project she's organizing could provide a lot of interesting insights to our project. And also, it's very exciting to have the student presentations as well, because over the 2 days we didn't have any presentation from architectural perspective or design perspective, but that is a good opportunity to learn what's going on in Singapore and other Asian cities. So I invite Simone to make an introduction to the whole presentation, and also I ask you to sort of chairing this session. Of course, I'm also participating,
Okay, thank you.
Too. Okay, so could you start it?
Simone? Yeah, I'm sharing screen now. Okay, I hope you can all see my screen now. First of all, I wish to thank Professor Mori Yoshitaka for inviting me to present at the Art, Research and Practice Conference this weekend, and of course to the organizing team at Tokyo University of the Arts for their hard work in putting this event together. So as Professor Mori was explaining, so instead of like a conventional keynote, what I'll be doing this afternoon is to provide an overview of my research practice and how this aligns with the Master of Architecture Design studio I currently run at the National University of Singapore. So after my kind of like introduction, I will then hand over the figurative mic over to Chua Ming Hao and Zhu Zhen Fu Wei, two of the master students from the studio last year, who with their respective project partners, Victor Ang and Melissa Ong, who I noted are actually attending this conference at the moment as well, they achieved quite very thought-provoking outputs. So I thought that in order to do justice to the words, the audience should really ought to understand the projects through their own words. So the presentations will, I believe, also offer you grounded insights into how creative disciplines such as architecture are employing new technologies for spatial explorations and reframing the format for multimodal representations, how different approaches are being adopted and adapted, be they iterative refinement or analogistic collocations. Okay, so to begin, we are currently living in an era where mixed realities and hybrid modes of operating are increasingly the norm. The fluid way in which we move between online and offline, and also how we manage them, such as what we've been doing in this conference over the last 2 days, is very much evidence of the increasing dilution between perceptual divides, not only in terms of information access, social interactions, and creative collaborations, but also in everyday transactions. Hyperreality, the film still that you see here, is a crowd-funded project by Matsuda Keiichi, an architecture graduate turned filmmaker based in London. The speculative short film imagines a future where every aspect of our lives and even our identities are inextricably tethered to online services and a multitude of apps. Okay, so to put some theoretical context into what I'm going to be talking about, in his book, The Second Digital Turn, Design Beyond Intelligence, the architectural historian and theorist Mario Capo is convinced that we now have entered the next phase of our relationship with technology. So digital integration means we no longer simply employ digital tools for design, but think through them. At this point in time, Although computational tools have transformed the workflow of professional practice and construction principles, the impact still resides predominantly in the production side. So granted, words such as generative architecture or parametricism, digital fabrication, 3D printing, and bespoke mass customization have entered the design vocabulary. We also have thought experiments, meanwhile, have extended to biosynthetic form making, such as this performative piece of living architecture titled Magic Queen by the interdisciplinary practice MAID. The constructed soil landscape is essentially a techno-organic environment that is continuously being shaped by a responsive robotic arm over the duration of the Venice Biennale for Architecture, which Professor Mori mentioned. I just returned from last week and is now serving my quarantine in my flat in Singapore. But from a research standpoint, I actually view the incorporation of creative technologies and digital tools for studying and communicating spatial phenomena as an inevitable progression. But this is still pretty much as a nascent stage. So since 2019, I have led a tech-driven design studio with Mary Ann Ng at the Master of Architecture level. Its project-based mode of learning allows students to explore digital design toolkits and develop skill sets aligned with their interests and technological disposition. Impactful teaching, according to the educator Ernest Bower, demands that we do more than just transmit knowledge, but also to actively transform and expand it. Rather than superficially engaging with new technologies for their novelty value, we advocate ways of utilizing digital tools for spatial research and design ideations. Okay, just to illustrate my point, new research tools and interpretive media can be used to produce accurate autoethnographic visual spatial documentations and these findings and communicate these findings with greater clarity. So for her study of a smartphone user's digital habits, this student of mine taught herself basic coding to modify an existing app that would allow her to track her body's movements in relation to phone activities. Okay. She then went on to render the space-time displacements in relation to the smartphone user's activities through a series of animated mappings rendered into this short video. Conversely, free-to-use developer platforms and affordable apps can also be used to create three-dimensional drawings in space. In other words, 3D forms in real time. They serve as visual evidence of embodied actions. This ongoing documentation of household chores using tilt brush by two students allows us to appreciate the actual acts of labor entailed in the provision of care and residential upkeep that's performed by live-in foreign domestic workers that are so essential to many families in Singapore. Yeah. But looking beyond my practice, an architectural research translation output that I found very effective is this moving image projection, Powers of Scale, by Saito Seiichi and Rhizomatics Architecture, which was featured in the Japan in Architecture, Genealogy of its Transformation exhibition that ran at the Moriarty Museum in 2019. According to its authors, this work focuses on the true measurements of the scale of a space, in particular historical buildings and other buildings that cannot be regularly accessed, such as Fujinori Teranobu's quirky Takasugiyan Tea House in Nagano Prefecture, or Kurokawa Kisho's iconic Nakagin capsule units, or the classical Japanese tea house. So they are concerned that humans have become so accustomed to the virtual world due to the technological advancements, such that when present in actual space, there seems to be a loss of awareness and interest in changes to one's immediate surroundings. So this research-based artistic work forces us to rethink the human scale in relation to relatable architectural examples. Now, whether or not this was intentional, I read the title of the project as an acknowledgement to the educational films from the 1960s and 1970s that were produced by the Eames office, founded by the husband and wife team Charles and Ray Eames. Specifically, their groundbreaking Powers of 10 short film that was commissioned by IBM and inspired by Key's book's illustrated children's book, Cosmic View from 1957. The Eames are notable for being architects who operated beyond the confines of building design and treated the discipline more holistically as an expanded field that called for collaborations with experts from other fields, projects that are grounded in research and outputs that are imbued with an educational purpose. The Inn's foray into film production is unsurprising when we consider the shared intertextual beginnings of cinema and modern architecture that originated in Western Europe in the late 19th century. Okay. Furthermore, I would say architects have traditionally worked across different media and in multimedia formats, depending on the stage and nature of the project. Long before we had the emergence of new media and the invention of electronic screens, concrete artifacts such as drawings and scaled models constituted the means with which they express their ideas and aesthetic intent. This detailed still life by Joseph Michael Gandy, a longtime collaborator of the renowned 18th century English architect Sir John Soane, pictorially depicts the voluminous construction models that his industrious mentor produced over the span of his illustrious career. The watercolor is an instance whereby one media is applied to highlight another. What also needs to be noted is that Gandy himself is a trained draftsman, an architect in his own right, but was deemed by Sir John Soane as the most suitable artist to capture the latter's vision of his work and legacy. Now, spurred on by the Enlightenment, you had visionary architects such as Etienne Louis Boulle, who strove towards the dematerialization of architecture. So working within the constraints of traditional representation media, they utilized the humble, low-tech cartridge paper, charcoal, drafting pens, and brush. What was not constrained, however, was the power of the human imagination. Boulle's most unforgettable project is this astonishing piece of paper architecture that details his proposal for a cenotaph for the scientist Sir Isaac Newton, himself a symbol of the Enlightenment. Boulle sought to demonstrate how architecture as art could rival science as the means of exploring the laws of nature through expression. A feeling of the sublime is evoked in the sense of the vastness, infinity, and awe in the immense space that's illustrated in drawing. In this section, the night effects occurs in the daytime outside when the sarcophagus is illuminated by sunlight filtering through the holes in the vault. This gives the illusion of stars in the night sky and infinity of the cosmos. So through the manipulation of scale and material effects, the experience induced is at once immersive and atmospheric. Now, moving on, the American architect Frank Lloyd Wright once said that the power of architecture resides in what we cannot directly perceive. The Pepsi Pavilion at the 1970 Expo in Osaka is an example that reflects this ambition. Realized by the non-profit organization Experiments in Art and Technology, supported by Bell Laboratories, the highly multidisciplinary collective made up of artists, scientists, and computer engineers sought to bridge the divide between the sciences and the humanities, and they were at the forefront of media art innovation. The building's spherical form is of secondary importance, as the pavilion is simply a vehicle for delivering a sensorial experience. The false skin devised by artist Nakaya Fujiko shrouded the structure such that it appeared to have an indeterminate form. And inside the pavilion, visitors are enveloped in a deeply sensorial environment that produces a decentering experience due to the electronic music soundscape, the lighting effects, and all-around mirror reflections that you see in this photograph here. So architecture is triumphantly dematerialized and overtaken by sensorially induced effects. Now, our design studio takes up the challenge to explore the digital medium's capacity to deliver meticulously crafted immersive environments, or perhaps an artifact that could prompt discourse. Craft is the operative term here, for it encapsulates the creative intuition and inventive trait that defines our discipline. We only need to look to the antiquities and reflect on the circumstances directing the work and fate of Daedalus, a mythological figure, and the forerunner of architects. In this 18th century engraving by Cézanne, Daedalus in mid-air is depicted with two of his most associated creations. So below him is the labyrinth on the island of Crete he designed for the king of Minos to imprison the Minotaur, a human-bovine hybrid. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, Daedalus is said to have done such a splendid job with constructing this impenetrable maze that he barely made it out himself. Yet, as the master craftsman who built such a highly complex prison, this also means that of all those stranded on the island, he possessed the highest chance to escape successfully. This he did by ingeniously fabricating lightweight flying contraptions made out of feather and wax for both his son Icarus and himself. The earthbound, mere mortals' masterful manipulation of space on land and in the sky, comes at a grave cost. As we all know, Icarus falls to his death when he flies too close to the sun and the wax on his wings melt. So the polemic surrounding the artifact Daedalus invents pits human agency against predetermined fate. Okay. So the British design duo, Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby, who are also educators, challenged the assumption most people have that design is primarily concerned with problem solving. They instead suggest that speculative design can be a powerful tool for thinking about possible futures. Conjuring probable scenarios offer up spaces for critical debate and discourse. They say, design can give experts permission to let their imagination flow freely, give material expression to the insights generated, ground these imaginings in everyday situations, and provide platforms for further collaborative speculation, quote unquote. But they also continue that to find inspiration for speculating through design, we need to look beyond design to the methodological playgrounds of cinema, literature, science, ethics, politics, and art, to explore, to hybridize, to borrow, and embrace the many tools available for crafting not only things, but also ideas. Now, what continues to underpin the studio's work is the role of space in narrative construction and digital technology to the experience of space and place, like the short clip of the virtual Venice project I just screened earlier. For the studio's exploration last year, for which Ming Hao and Hu Wei will be talking about a bit more later, at the height of the global health pandemic, we drew inspiration from Italo Calvino's novella, Invisible Cities. In it, there's scores of imaginative simulacra of the historical city-state of Venice that are vicariously recounted by a fictional Marco Polo to Kublai Khan whom he visits at court. With the whole world grounded to a halt, we instead let our imagination take flight, guided by the potency of masterful storytelling. For this reason, the choice of the surrealist painter René Magritte's artwork for the cover of the first edition published by Einaudi in Turin is an apt example, for it speaks to the mysteries of the mind. Invisible Cities, being a work of fantasy fiction, is a great example of how space as a context and as referent. Narratives not only describe space, but also involve important players, with the target audience quite clearly specified. So in Calvino's work, he is as much the storyteller to us, the readers, as Marco Polo is to the great Khan. According to Marie-Laure Ryan, space can intersect with narrative in two principal ways. On one hand, it is an object of representation. On the other, it can function as the environment in which narrative is physically deployed. So as a text ripe for interpretation, we began by unearthing some of the subtext contained within Invisible Cities via a quick translation exercise that involved crafting visual and three-dimensional responses, of which some are shown here. And referencing Marie-Laure Ryan again, she says that the use of real-world locations is not limited to factual narratives. Certain types of narrative form are tied to particular places and historical moments in all their social and political complexities. What quickly became evident as the studio progressed was a pervasive peripatetic impulse, a reflection of this period of restricted travels and lockdown. So like Daedalus orchestrating his escape from Crete with his son Icarus, or Italo Calvino channeling the demigod Perseus in his 6 Memos for the Millennium, in which he writes, "Whenever humanity seems condemned to heaviness, I think I should fly like Perseus, carried by his winged steed Pegasus into a different space." So technophilia and imaginative speculations offered temporary escapism, mediated through fluid virtual environments or discursive provocations. Okay, identifying the appropriate media to translate each project's inquiry-driven investigations and findings not only advances new forms and formats of architectural representation and spatial experience, shaped by a range of virtualities, but also forces us to question the ways we have operated in our respective disciplines to date. The open brief format of the studio is necessary to activate reflection in action that's outlined in Donald Schron's framework for the reflective practitioner, where emphasis shifts from problem solving, which is typically the focus of design learning in architectural school, to process, which includes problem framing, identifying suitable theories and methodologies, prototyping, and making improvements following feedback. Oops. Now, in our case, cross-tech explorations constitute vital exercises in tactility and lateral thinking, such as the research visualizations that I showed earlier, just as they are utilized for structuring new experiences and subjectivities, which we will see later on. Both projects pursue very different lines of inquiries that both projects that Meng Hao and Bu Wei will share pursue very different lines of inquiries that in turn determine the provocations posed by their speculative outputs. Yeah. I also just want to add before finishing my introduction that exposure to interdisciplinarity is crucial to what we do. For this reason, our review sessions always involve creative technologies and artists besides architects and academics. In her article, Architectural Research and Disciplinarity, Jane Randall suggests interdisciplinarity be encountered organically. For it is, I quote, often a difficult and transformational experience, combining critical engagement with the emergence of new forms of knowledge that are not yet classifiable, unquote. Discovery is what makes research-led artistic endeavors meaningful in our pursuit of new and different kinds of knowledge, and along the way, infuse a reflective dimension to practice. So I will just end my introduction here, and I will hand over it over to Meng Hao, and then followed by Bu Wei, who will be talking about their projects Relativity 6 and Death in Venice. Yeah. I also want to say that this is probably their first time presenting at the international conference, so I beg the audience's patience and gentleness when it comes to the Q&A. So what we'll do is we will have their presentations, and then together we will have the Q&A. Okay, Meng Hao, over to you.
Thank you, Simone. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, so good afternoon. My name is Meng Hao. And together with my partner, Victor, I'll be presenting on our project, Relativity 6. So Relativity 6 seeks to use the potential of VR. Using a virtual simulation, the project seeks to explore design guidelines that can be laid out for orbital space habitat architecture by understanding how people perceive omnidirectional spaces and understand wayfinding as a result of architectural artifacts and objects. So our project was split into 3 phases. Firstly, we did background research on space travel and human perception. This allowed us to situate our project and make clear what was the main contribution to knowledge. Next, we developed a suitable interface before carrying out our experiments. Finally, we drew some inferences from the experimental results and thus proposed a sort of a conceptual design. So this design serves mainly as a proof of concept, proving the usefulness of such methodologies. So phase 1. Firstly, we examined space tourism such that we could streamline and justify our research project. So space tourism is currently in its nascent stage. Due to advancements in technology, 3D printing has become significantly cheaper and accessible, and we foresee that space tourism will be increasingly common in the future. For example, Space Adventures recently sent 4 civilian tourists into low orbit on 15th of September this year aboard the SpaceX Dragon shuttle. So engineer Derek Weber also compares the current stage of space tourism to early aviation. More importantly, he divides space tourism into 4 categories: suborbital, orbital, point-to-point, and lunar. And for the sake of this project, we'll be focusing on the orbital aspect. So space architect Brent Sherwood argues that manned spaceflight is essential, and in the function mentioned here, he states that the role of humans is irreplaceable. So we next go on to establish the context by examining current design approaches towards space habitats through the lens of the user experience. Habitats are generally perceived as sterile, hostile, and functional. It's mainly focused on practicality and functionality, and is usually catered towards highly trained professionals. The design usually does not consider the user experience of general consumers, and architects only enter the design at the end phases, and possibilities for intervention are extremely limited. So Vera Martinez here reviews the user experience of several historical space stations. From the left to right, you can see Salyut, Mir, Skylab, as well as the ISS, the current one. So she argues that space stations can draw from the designs of yachts, transatlantic cruise ships, and even luxury passenger airplanes, as they have a good focus of how public and private spaces can be defined in confined areas. So we like to note that outer space habitats have the potential to function in more than one plane. Architect and educator Andre Du breaks down how no floor or ceiling plane is needed in microgravity. Interestingly, It points out that large volumes could be potentially dangerous, as without any surface to move off from, the spacefarer could get immobilized. So there have been multiple proposals for space habitats throughout the years, and we note that there has been a gap in the design for space habitats that exist in orbit. So next, we look at the context and attempt to bridge this sort of gap. So current studies revolve mainly around two key modes, which are speculative planetary settlements and point-to-point space travel. We shall look through some of these proposals. So these two examples show a focus towards planetary settlements. The issue here are much bigger picture, focusing on the sustainability of the settlement as a whole, instead of focusing on the individual experience. So orbital habitats are very much in the speculative phase right now, although the Gateway Foundation, a private company, has proposed a rotating spaceport to be built as early as 2025. It is important to note, however, that rotating spaceports will exhibit gravity through centrifugal force, and thus are distinct from microgravity. So as shown, many of these proposals have focused on settlements either on the moon or other planets, and studies of this habitability of orbital space stations and microgravity for general consumer population is limited. Therefore, this project aims to focus on this gap in research and focus on the design of microgravity environments in orbital space habitats. So to understand how we view perception in space, we looked at humans' perception and the way in which it has been challenged. We drew inspiration through the works of M.C. Escher and René Magritte. We also reviewed literature on the effect of the uncanny, which we speculate will be of importance in unfamiliar environments as space. Finally, we also reviewed cultural references through playful depictions of space in popular culture. So firstly, we speculate that commercial orbital space habitat design will be predominantly omnidirectional. We see this sort of parallel to what we see on the right with the impossible worlds depicted by M.C. Escher, like the pictures you see. So spaces should thus be conceived of as a relational volume. Next, the poetics of space is like an important text to understand the uncanny. So the most important note here is that the home comprises a collection of memories associated with our conscious and unconscious lives. We've tried to use this concept of the uncanny as a starting point in many of our experiments as well, in order to understand the importance of visual affordance in the design of space habitats. So certain games have explored the use of this sort of Escher-esque designs to challenge perceptions as well, as you can see here on the right with Monument Valley, a famous iOS game. So now we will look at studies of proprioception in virtual environments. So proprioception refers to the sense of self-movement and the awareness of the body position. As VR technology is used in our study, the effects of a virtual environment in proprioception is important. So the study on the right makes a case that VR can be a suitable surrogate to understand proprioception. A person was induced into the ownership of a virtual arm, as you can see here, and a physical motor response was recorded when the threat occurred to the virtual arm. After elongating the virtual arm to 3 times the length you can see on the right, the study showed that the effect of the arms will be diminished due to the lower visual precision. So I think this study affirmed that VR can be a suitable surrogate in understanding proprioception if there's a certain level of visual precision. However, bodily orientation was not covered in this study. So this is another study in which the neurophysiologists studied the effects of varying gravitational conditions on human proprioception. It shows how the human body, or the way we perceive our movement and our body, is altered in varying gravity conditions. So what is important here is that the visual cues can be used to quickly reorient individuals. So we found it essential as a final part of the research to chart the journey that space travel and science fiction has taken throughout the years. So this is a collage of a timeline consisting of realized projects, theoretical proposals, and science fiction from the inception of space travel to present day. What we found interesting was that their journeys often parallel each other. And in hindsight, science fiction has always projected from current space travel technology. These projections then often come back to the field of space travel as material for speculative research. So now we highlight the main trajectories we will use for our project. So our target demographic is the passengers or untrained civilians with no formal training. We then outline a framework to understand a few criteria that we will judge perception based on our research. We were aware that categories may not be as clear-cut. However, such a model is still helpful for us to frame our thinking. We will look at various groups such as psychological, biological, and social-cultural aspects, which will then branch out into minor categories such as scale, form, spatial arrangement, maybe even furnishing or navigational tools. So now we move on to the second phase of the design, the development and the trial phase. So virtual reality as a design tool here is used as a simulation for microgravity environments, which we were able to test optimal configurations and spaces based on the three factors which we explored earlier in our research: omnidirectionality, vertical orientation, and visual affordances. So this is our initial experiment on the full body inverse kinematics for immersion. However, due to incompatibility, we decided not to pursue this interface. So there's my partner Victor over there. So next, we find a control scheme for our VR spacefarers. Importantly, we have two modes of locomotion. Firstly, to grab onto walls and move, similar to astronauts do in space travel. However, for convenience sake, we have also included thrusters, which will allow them to propel through large spaces. So we outlined a few key interfaces that the user should have for maximum immersion and conducted trials over 22 unique test subjects. So our main mode of development here was Unreal Engine, as it suited the VR platform which we were using. So this is our first refined tutorial level, and the subjects start off in a real environment on the left before being transported to the virtual environment. So our research showed that we needed to allow users to acclimatize before they could take ownership of their virtual bodies. So through the creation of this tutorial stage, users were able to grasp the controls in relation to their virtual bodies in space. We were also able to record preliminary observations about unexperienced users' movement in simulated outer space. Lastly, they were moved to the third stage, the lobby stage, where they experience a full unrestricted omnidirectional environment. So this is our tutorial level and the different stages they were put together in order to grasp the controls. So I'll just be playing a video right now. And for those at home, if you would like, you can also use the QR code to watch the video. So after the tutorial stage, we launched our users into a complete omnidirectional space, which was a modified version of MC Escher's relativity that we explored earlier, and recorded the observations of their movement around such a space, which was devoid of any function or affordances. So here are some images of the modified Escher's relativity, in which we launched our participants into as well. So next, we attempted preliminary trials to determine a range of volumes for our spaces. Through an experiment of different spaces, we attempt to chart the movement of the human body through simulated space environments to determine the volume or design of spaces which will be most optimized for movement as well as habitability. So here's a diagram of our different permutations of spaces in which we engage our tests, starting from the smaller scale of 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters, all the way up to the largest scale, which will be 8 meters, 8 by 8 meters by 8 meters. So as noted in our research, we wanted to test the mobility of our users. So we used the metrics of thruster use, a function we implemented earlier, as well as the travel time they took to reach from one end to another, to derive a locomotion index, a coefficient which we define in order to gauge the mobility possible in our modules. We've documented the smallest rooms and the largest rooms through video, as you can see above, and certain aspects such as claustrophobia and difficulty of propulsion make it unsuitable for users to live in 2 by 2 by 2 environments. So you can see here, Victor is testing out this environment as a start before we let our users try it. So likewise, in the largest scale example, the 8 by 8 by 8 meters, the vastness of the three-dimensional space also made it difficult to navigate, suggesting that there were possible optimal dimensions for creating spaces in microgravity environments. So as you can see here, the lack of any objects, it makes it hard for the user to actually move through the space because it is empty. So here are the results, which take an average of the time taken as well as the average thruster use to calculate their locomotion index on the right. So the higher the index, the more favorable the environment is for navigation and mobility. So we note certain peaks in certain volumes when we plot this onto a graph. And therefore, we gathered a few permutations of volumes with the highest locomotion index, as you can see here, with which we could begin constructing various spaces. So for example, the 3 times 3 times 7 meter volume has an express directionality and a strong line of movement. And we noted that the 6 meter by 6 meter by 3 meter volume is suitable for large communal or recreational spaces. So moving on to our primary investigation, we attempted to craft spaces with function and asked our blinded test subjects for their perceptions of these spaces. So here are some of the more significant iterations which we constructed and tested. So this is one of our earlier modules, a personal quarters for rest and relaxation. We looked at several different lighting conditions, as well as suggestive visual affordances to investigate the relationship drawn between the users and the environment. This module was meant as a communal space for dining that functioned on both the ground and the ceiling plane. So here are some of the observations made, which we then categorized based on our framework. This module was meant as a viewing gallery for space gazing. So through these feedbacks and our observations, we extracted learning points module by module. And here's a short video summary of the experiences of one of our test subjects through the various modules, which shows our methodology, as well as some observations recorded during the sessions. So finally, we proposed several conceptual designs based on our findings as a proof of concept I'll not go into too much detail here. So we derive basic yet flexible deployable modules from our research and case studies. So the dimensions indicated here is sufficiently mobile as well. Subsequent iterations adapted a modular approach of connecting various inflatable structures within a variety of different living spaces. So here are just some images of how the module expands and contracts, as well as the circulation through one of the modules. So from research, we also use an adjacency matrix in order to determine our macro-spatial organization. And this is other diagrams. So from the above parameters, we conceptualize the design of a space orbital hotel. So feel free to use this QR code to watch an internal fly-through video, but we will not be screening that video today. So these are just some various images to show how the modules come together, as well as the various functions of the modules. So for example, the habitation module emphasizes a strong and conventional reading of the local vertical, catering to the space tourist's shorter stay period. This orientation is minimized while still making use of vertical circulation. So these are just other examples of the modules that we came up with based on our research. So for example, in the dining and food preparation, key social activities, according to past astronauts, will take place within this module. And this spatial configuration respects social norms while still maximizing the novelty of dining in zero gravity. Yeah, so this is another module we've done. So thank you, and I hope that this presentation has stoked your imagination towards the possibility of VR, as well as its applications to design in microgravity environments.
Thank you, Ming-Hao. Yeah, just wanted to say that the upside of being in the design studio environment is that you can actually get your tutors to be the guinea pigs for your experiments. Okay, moving on, I'm gonna let Bu-Wei present.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, Dr. Simon. Very good afternoon to everyone who have taken time off to attend our presentation. My name is Zhusen Bu-Wei, and I will be presenting my project titled Death in Venice, which was conceived together with Melissa Ong Kai under the tutelage of Dr. Simon. Death in Venice is a multimedia project that attempts to capture the complexities and multitude of perspectives related to Venice's associations with death. Our project is essentially an allegorical and figurative project that provides stimuli for the creation of discourse and a multitude of perspectives. Our project has also drawn inspiration from one of the greatest Italian allegorical works, Dante's Inferno, as well as Italo Calvino's Invincible Cities, another fictional book in which Marco Polo gives multiple vastly different descriptions of the same city to Kublai Khan. The multitude of perspectives incorporated are largely based upon Neil Robbins' Venice and Odyssey, Hope, Anger, and the Future of Cities. The project also attempts to incorporate web-based augmented reality in order to craft out a multitude of narrative pathways. So for the flow of this presentation, I will talk about our initial processes before moving on to explain the frameworks we have appropriated to help guide us and perhaps offer greater insights into the various mediums produced as part of the project. I will then talk about the significance of the collages and architectural manifestations that make a significant part of the project, before showing how we attempted to compose these varied mediums into an exhaustive concept drawing of our project. Lastly, I will touch upon briefly how we have sought to integrate web-based augmented reality into our project, allowing the viewer to move through these disparate mediums. So from Invisible Cities, we learn how the literary tool of fictional allegory was able to incorporate a multitude of meanings and interpretations, as well as the possibility of a multitude of fictional descriptions based upon the very same city. In Venice Odyssey, we learn how extremely complex tensions and contestations are in Venice, most of which is centered around a dying Venice and the issues of mass tourism, sea level rise, and depopulation. What really stood out from these two readings was the idea of death in the urban context. Prior to COVID-19, this dichotomy is encapsulated in the quote from Venice and Odyssey. This moment is highly schizophrenic for Venice because it's the best of times and the worst of times. Within the pages of Venice and Odyssey was also this question: is Venice dying or is it already dead? So this first question implies that Venice is still alive and approaching its eventual end. It also suggests that Venice could be resuscitated and safe. Furthermore, it also implies that there have been a clear continuity from the past to contemporary Venice, and that current circumstances are so dire that it will break that continuity, leading to Venice's eventual death. The second part suggests otherwise. It suggests Venice is already dead. But then again, it also implies there's no eventual finality, that Venice will go through these cycles of life and death. So we had attempted to overlay Dante's Inferno, the first part of the larger plot of the Divine Comedy, with on the ground deathly symptoms of Venice, that happens within Venice. So Dante categorized sin into 9 hierarchical circles. Each sin is deemed more serious than the other one that came before, which results in harsher punishments. Dante's framework of categorizing sin also allows us to categorize the causes of symptomatic problems plaguing Venice, which is exactly what we did. So we substantiated the existence of circles through the gathering of photos, paintings of historical events, contemporary equivalents, or newspaper articles. What we did next was essentially a mapping process to spatialize the existence of these circles on Venice itself. So our mapping process involves assigning a particular circle to a landmark or a location based upon symbolic associations, notable incidents, or purely descriptive similarities. For example, the St. Mark's Basilica in front of St. Mark's Piazza houses artifacts that were the ill-gotten gains of Phoenician treachery towards Constantinople, then the seat of the Byzantine emperor. We assign St. Mark's to the circle of treachery. As we go through this process, we realize that many of these notable locations often appear in multiple circles. Our map is a visual representation where the main nodes of the circles are linked to other nodes within the same circle. Overlaying the different circles, the result is a complex web of sin and death that envelopes the entire city. So before we move on to the rest of the project, we believe it is necessary to talk about what other frameworks were used to guide and shape our project. So most of the frameworks we use is based on an essay by Penelope Haralampido. And what she talks about in her essay is that she gives a set of ideas as to how an allegorical project can be conceived. So the first thing she talks about is the allegorical architecture somehow mimics literary genres such as pseudo-history, manifesto, poetry, or satire. We think that the most relevant literary genres for our project are that of satire, pseudo-history, speculative fiction, and satire, which will be clearer as we move deeper into our project. The next aspect is that of allegorical traits, which is essentially the structure of stories. Penelope Haralampido broke it down to 2 main allegorical traits: structures of a battle or journey. A battle is where there are 2 opposing forces, the primary battle in our project being that of conservation and capitalism, which will become clearer later. A journey is where there is a transition between these different phases, which we think is encapsulated in the framework of Dante's 9 circles, where you basically move from circle to circle. Another form of journey in the project could also be seen in the linear timeline progression and process of our project, as it appears to have a process of refinement as we go through different mediums. For the visual and verbal aspect, drawing and text complement each other in the production of meaning. She goes on to assert that the naming of an object can affirm, contradict, or add additional information. That's why we've undertaken the task of naming, indexing, and adding captions to each individual element. The indexing allows for the implicit differentiation of circles and element types, and suggests the linearity and chronological order at which each element was created. The naming and captions also provided a gap where the allegorical interpretation of the view can take place. So in terms of the indexing, the first digit in the index determines which circle of hell the particular medium belongs to. So 1 would be limbo, 8 would be fraud, and so on and so forth. The second digit will determine the type of medium 1 would be. So in this case, 1 is for database, 2 is for collage, and 3 is for the manifestation. And then the index number, which is this 2 digit, is arbitrary just to separate the different mediums. So the next characteristic is that of figurative geometry, which is the use of everyday or sublime objects, sites to signify structural relationships, creating meaning and inviting interpretation in the process. This was achieved through the selection of sites through the mapping process mentioned before, as well as the architectural manifestations of each circle set in the specific locations as outlined by our mapping process. So the next characteristics is duplicity of meaning, that of double meaning in allegorical architecture. Similar to how written allegory has at least one second intended meaning, we attempt to design for a multitude of different intended interpretations in our manifestations. The characteristic of figurative geometry and double meaning is illustrated in our architectural manifestations, one example being that of the circle of violence, which we'll touch upon later. The next trait or framework that we incorporated in our project is the idea of linearity and web structure. As the indexing and chronological conception of each element suggests a linear process of refinement from site study and analysis, collage before ultimately culminating in the conception of architectural manifestations, we decide to introduce a second way of navigating through our work, inspired by Bernard Shumi's The Manhattan Transcripts. We interpreted these different modes of representation or mediums have inherent unique qualities and an exclusion of the other. This opens the possibility of navigating through our work, not only as a linear process of design refinement, but in a manner more akin to a web. This is facilitated through the use of seemingly repeated motifs or settings. It is a juxtaposition of different representational and medium formats in a flat manner, allowing the viewer to implicitly transgress the chronological and linear process by which the work was conceived and produced in. In doing so, creating a personalized and unique narrative of the project and the production of a multitude of meanings and interpretations. The last characteristic is that of the unfinished aspect of allegorical architecture, is that these projects are incompletable. According to Harun Lambido, this unfinished characteristic is because such projects are meant to invite a secondary creative act of interpretation from the viewer to complete the work. Next, I'll move on to our outputs. For this segment, after the mapping process, we undertook a collage process, which was our way of representing and synthesizing the different ideas distilled from our database of evidence of each of Dante's 9 circles, as well as the mapping process. Often, some of these collages allude to some of the specific sites. So here I would like to talk about a couple of collages. The first of which is a collage for the Circle of Las, which depicts a revival of the historical red light district centered around Ponte del Tete, where the red light district serves as a node for fictional sex tourism for the city of Venice. The bridge was lined with girls evoking historical accounts of prostitutes lining the bridge and the surrounding brothels in hopes of attracting a willing client. The next collage will be that of the 8th Circle of Fraud. We have believed that fraud always contains some element of deception. For the Venetians, the best known incident involving fraud would have been the misappropriation of funds by the former mayor, Orsolini. In looking for possible elements of deception within the realm of architecture, we believe that the false perspectives by Bramante in Chiesa di Santa Maria in Milan, as well as Rome's Borromini Arcade, are some of the ways optical illusions have been used to deceive the subject architecturally. Moving on, our next category of outputs are architectural manifestations. So what we did was to take a process of translating these collages into, in a way, a built form. So it was also a key part of the project in having the elements of figurative geometry, as mentioned in the earlier segment on frameworks. These imaginary structures also have a way of making the invisible issues and contestations more visible. I will explain briefly some of these manifestations, the first one of which will be the manifestation for the Circle of Violence. So this manifestation is sited in the vicinity of the Bridge of Fis, or Ponte de Bugni, an ancient site where rival clans will have fist fights, hence the name. We introduced the figurative geometry of a stadium centered around a bridge, whose violent past has been revived in the architectural program of a for-profit combat sports stadium, whose grandstand sits within or above the existing Venetian landscape. The platform's placement and angles are decided based upon possible vistas towards the bridge, highlighting the spectator aspect of the business in combat sport. The sharp angles and lines of the grandstands also create a situation of colliding geometries, further accentuating the uneasiness of the whole structure. The structural system that holds up these grandstands violate the private spaces of the Venetian residents below. The placement of the grandstands seemed to represent an attempt to exist in harmony with the existing landscape. However, the geometry and structural system still illustrates a sort of violence upon the Venetian people and their homes. In a way, this shows how every act has a sort of violent aspect to it, which bears similarities to Heidegger's philosophy in Introduction to Metaphysics, where we are essentially violent beings. This violent outcome or side effect is very much unavoidable as seen from the very presence of this stadium. This manifestation could also be interpreted as a critical view that there is no way to truly prevent negative externalities arising from capitalistic pursuits. Our next manifestation we would like to talk about comes from the circle of fraud. So drawing upon inspiration from the false perspectives in architecture as well as idyllic and romantic ideals often perpetuated by the government of Venice, we thought it was rather apt to have huge billboards that obscure the realities of certain key landmarks of Venice. The one pictured in this slide is the Real Alto Bridge, where often pictures and tourism marketing material often pictures a serene scene with the focal point being the bridge. But in reality, before COVID-19, the sheer mass of transient day tourists provides a very different experience to the idyllic, serene, and picturesque marketing materials circulated on the web. The next architectural manifestation that we would like to talk about is that that belongs to the circle of treachery. So, for the treachery manifestation, I must first explain our take on how we define treachery, at least in the context of Venice. We think that many of the issues of Venice can be traced back to the mismanagement and almost a betrayal of the municipal authorities towards the history and local populace. Dante would have categorized it as traitors to their country. We think that this scene has far greater consequences for Venice and imagine it as something totally out of line. For this circle, we think it will be manifested architecturally in the form of highways cutting through the city, all in the name for allowing greater accessibility and flow of tourism dollars to the city of Venice. The end result is a network of highways and parking and multi-story parking lots that violate every aspect of the urban landscape, similar to how governmental mismanagement would lead to possibly far-reaching consequences for their people. So next, as this project was conceived in the setting of an architectural school, we believe it was necessary for us to attempt to create an exhaustive visual representation of the frameworks used in our project and disparate mediums. So as mentioned before, the linear process of refinement is captured in the vertical composition of each script, suggesting a process of refinement and chronological order. First, we have the database references followed by the collages and the manifestations at the bottom. Horizontal linearity as played out graphically by the superstructure and the placement of the strips suggests a form of hierarchy for the circles, which is a key aspect of Dante's framework as well. The linearity both vertically and horizontally is also highlighted through the indexing notation system suggesting hierarchy within the circle and outside of circle. So the web structure of navigating through our project is visualized through the simple superimposition of a linkages diagram between the different mediums. So this is a full view of the drawing that we created as part of our project. So, and lastly, we did attempt to have some form of web augmented reality application where the web AR integration adds to the project is that it facilitates the linear web structure of navigating through our disparate mediums. Yeah. So basically the top buttons of the AR web-based app allows you to go from medium to medium based on some of the routes that we have foreseen or curated, but it will be entirely possible to simply type in a particular index code at the back of the URL to generate your own narrative pathway as one moves from medium to medium. So this is just a demo to show how you would move from basically one medium to the next within our project in the form of a augmented reality web-based application. Yeah. Yeah, and with that, I've come to the end of my presentation. I hope it was an insightful presentation for all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to conclude with just a few observations or just clarification. So the very first the first project, Relativity 6, I mean, I guess the audience can sense that it was a very serious research involved in it. At the same time, the premise of it was pretty much kind of satirical because it was like sort of like in response to like the space tourism boom that's literally been taking off in the last couple of years, right? And the second project, Death in Venice, is very much intermedial in its nature. So the very important part was that it was very dialogic. And probably what might not come across as clearly is the level of interactivity that's entailed in both projects. So it really is quite immersive and very interactive. So for those who are interested to see more, to read more or see more about the outputs from not just these two projects, but the others that we've been doing over the last 2-3 years, I've also included the website, our studio's website, on the chat group, as well as like the Instagram account. So yeah.
Okay.
So, back to the chair.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the sort of very interesting presentation. And it's I don't know what. To be honest, I'm not confident whether I understand everything you mentioned, because I mean, if you can sort of if we can experience sort of interactive devices, maybe we can feel what's going on eventually, because it's more like a demo, we saw. So I probably so we cannot experience in a way. I mean, because it's only a sort of online presentation, but still that was really sort of inspiring, and also the how I mean, kind of those who are working in the architecture or design area use the artistic research to kind of provide to create a new sort of speculative kind of architecture. So I don't know how if anyone want to ask a question or make a comment? I've got many.
Well, while we're waiting for questions, I also just wanted to say that I was very taken by Professor Okahara's keynote from yesterday, but based on what the English notes were on the presentation, and I felt that I could actually I tried really hard to understand Japanese. But yeah, for me, I actually felt that I could relate, like with what we're doing, relate to many of some of the characteristics that he was describing for art-based research. Yeah, so so I just felt like I wanted to say that.
But one question that I think the interesting is that basically so far over the last 2 days we are kind of, when we say the research, it's more like anthropological or sociological research. But in your presentation, it's more like a scientific research, or also using a sort of literature imagination as well. I mean, literature or sci-fi, or these sort of different sort of knowledge to apply design or architecture, right? So my question is, when you have this project, do you have any collaborators in the science department or kind of biology or literature?
Well, not so much in science, but we actually work with creative technologists at the early stage of like the semester, because I'm not a technologist. I actually have absolutely no expertise in this whatsoever. So I'm an academic. That's where my strength is, and I can actually critique a lot of things, and I'm also very critical about technology as well. So that's why the premise of the studio is that even though we're very tech driven, but at the same time, I want like the students or even myself, when we're using it, to really try to think about what we're using it for, and like what is it that we really want to achieve. So again, it's a form of like ongoing critique and ongoing reflection. So I wanted to say that we actually work with the creative technologists in the early part of the development, because there's a lot, this is to help with like input as to what is the right translation medium. There's so many ways to probably develop a project, especially something as something as vague as probably an early speculative proposal. So that's the very important part, and that goes back to the notion of representation. And again, the representation aspect is very much tied to what the architecture discipline is. That's why I sort of introduced some of the earlier forms of like representational media that architects have traditionally worked with, even before we entered this digital milieu.
I know what you mean, but still, I know it's not really a technological presentation, but also critique of technology. But at the same time, well, particularly the first one, the Minhaus, relatively six. It sounds, really, it sounds you know technology a lot. Maybe I mean you learned a lot about the sort of spatial habitat from science perspective, didn't you? I mean, I just curious how you think about your knowledge about kind of this scientific knowledge, or you are just using as a representation of technology or science or space.
How you want to answer that? Your mic is off.
Oh. Yeah, so I think me and my partner Victor, we both started off not knowing too much, but I think throughout the course of the studio as well, we were exposed to more varied forms of technology, and we just sort of tried to look at how it can help us, especially as architecture students, how we can leverage on these sort of technologies to actually sort of propose or like derive a different sort of methodology. And in this case, what we decided on was space architecture, because we thought, firstly, it's a rising trend, and secondly, I think it's one of the things which VR can afford us, because we can't always have tests of real space objects. So I thought VR could be a effective or a interesting way in which we can use as sort of a framework as well. Yeah.
Yeah, the one of the things is that obviously you're right. I mean, the kind of to think about space travel is a sort of trendy issue, and a lot of rich people want to go to space to travel, and it's really a good timing to think about that. How the architect can contribute to the trend recently.
Yeah, because that's actually an under-addressed part. I mean, like again, with all this like space travel discourse, no one has actually talked about what it really means to have to design habitats in omnidirectional space, right? So we're so used to dealing with like earthbound, on the gravitational plane, but then again, the spatial paradigms completely changed when you really don't have that gravity grounding you. So I mean, it's a very valid question. And again, it's really valid for further research, even at the exploratory studio-based level.
And also the second issue, the death in Venice, is quite interesting, because obviously it's always discussing how Venice can survive in the future, particularly because of environmental crisis, right? So, and also that Venice has a lot of history and literature too. So that Venice is not only the kind of physical city, but like you said, it's more like a sort of constructed by the kind of different discursive formation, and then how we understand Venice is very big topic now, and so the kind of the presentation gives some ideas how we understand Venice from contemporary perspective, particularly by using sort of different literature and artistic references. Have you been to Venice anyway? I mean, yeah.
No, actually no. I've never been to Venice. Yeah, so it was mostly based on because I think when the time we took our studio, it was when COVID-19 just started.
Oh yes.
Yeah. So I think at first our professor did plan for a trip, yeah, but unfortunately we couldn't go. So it was really about looking through like reading and looking at most of our material came from the book by Neil Robbins. Yeah, so it was trying to understand this kind of like it goes I guess it goes deeper because we understand the certain like kind of problems that impact Venice, and I think that's because the book was our starting point. So that's what we wanted to show in our project essentially. Just all these like underlying kind of problems that the city was facing. In a way, it's also it wasn't prescriptive. We didn't want to really say like, oh, this is how we could solve it and things like that, but rather to provide a kind of like stimulus to generate discourse. Yeah, just essentially the whole part of the project. Yeah. So each one of these item or artifact is in itself has a kind of significance. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and also again, like the artifacts are not expected to be read in a particular sequence. So again, the direction of the narrative is very much based on the user itself. Yeah, like what Paul was saying. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. Yeah, initially the studio was supposed to be tied with the Venice Biennale project that I was curating.
Right.
So that was why like you will note that even in my overview just now, Venice prefigures a lot. But then what became quite interesting was later on when we started to decouple this Venice as an artifact, the city, with like what the meanings and all the issues that it actually conveyed implicitly. So then that was actually where the speculation really took flight. Again, the moment we decoupled it. So and again, it was also like with like the Pu and Melissa's project, the fact that he mentioned that Neil Robinson's Venice and Odyssey was kind of like the primary text was because of the multi-perspectival position that the author took in terms of like trying to convey all these issues, all these multi-layered social, political, environmental issues that's plaguing Venice.
How was the response from your colleagues? I mean, in the Department of Architecture, I'm very curious how the kind of conventional architects respond to the project.
I have to say that all the students did really well last year. They did way better than I expected. But also, I mean, like, okay, this goes back to my own background because even though I'm an architect, I studied architecture, I practice as an architect, but my work has always Professor Mori knows me quite well, so you already know that my work is always pretty much, I always work in a cross-disciplinary context and also like in a very interdisciplinary manner, right? So that already pretty much determined the direction of the studio that I teach. But at the same time, I think like my colleagues actually, we have really good feedbacks as well, in the sense that what they do is very different. So again, it's not very much tied to like conventional ways of thinking about architecture. And again, it's high time that we actually do adapt to like ongoing discourse. I mean, like I always say like art, art, socially engaged art, or even just like art activism actually provokes so much more. And again, I don't see why the environmental discipline is not also responding in kind as well, even at the like discourse or at the discursive level.
Yeah. Okay, so I was still waiting for the sort of question or comment from the audience, but at this moment, maybe the audience might be exhausted for that long day. So I think if you have any question or comments, maybe you can send an email to Simone and student, or maybe send an email to me, and then I will pass it to the speakers. So probably I should stop here. It's already time to finish. So thank you very much for the good presentation. And actually, I have a lot of inspiration from the presentation, and that's very very how can I put? That's very creative, research. So thank you very much indeed. So can we start?
Thank you.